Cambridge Philosophy Classics. Jonathan Bennett, Kant'S Analytic. Preface to this edition, James Van Cleve. Bennett's Kant'S Analytic is one of the two great Kant books of the 1960s, the other being Strawson, The Bounds of Sense. These books cast new light on Kant's doctrines and arguments in the Critique of Pure Reason, and set several generations of philosophers to grappling with Kant. Not everyone agreed with Bennett's approach to Kant, which he continued to pursue in subsequent works on the early modern philosophers. He said in the 1966 preface that he was going to fight Kant tooth and nail, and so he did. He treated Kant as someone to deal with in the journals, demanding clarification of some points, offering clarification on others, perhaps using contemporary diction or distinctions, setting forth his arguments more explicitly than the master himself had, and subjecting the results to this passionate evaluation. It was philosophy of a high order, so good that some of his critics refused to accept it as history of philosophy, apparently believing that no one could do both things at once. There can be no going back on some of the distinctions and expository memes Bennett introduced. There is the observation that while for Locke and Hume to have a concept is to harbor an introspectable mental item, for Kant it is to have the ability to recognize certain things, draw certain inferences, and answer certain questions. There is the capsule description of the transcendental deduction as showing that we cannot have experience without employing concepts, and the metaphysical deduction as showing that to use any concept we must use Kant's favorite dozen. There is the distinction between the genetic bad and the analytic good, forms in which a thesis may be propounded. What Hume offered as an account of the causal conditions that make us believe in the existence of bodies is better seen as an analysis of what it means for bodies to exist. What Kant offered as a transcendental psychological theory of the operations that produce unity of consciousness is more profitably construed as an account of the criteria representations must satisfy to belong to a single self. The most exciting part of Bennett's book are those in which he analyzes the notion of objectivity and advances Kant-inspired arguments for the existence of an objective realm. He thinks Berkeley and Hume, who believed that objects were collections of ideas, could believe in objectivity only by believing that ideas could exist unperceived, which they cannot. Kant, by contrast, believed that the existence of objective or mind-independent items just be analyzed somehow in terms of representations and the rules they follow, but not by way of any identification of objects with ideas or representations. Moreover, Bennett contends that Kant has sound arguments for the thesis that self-consciousness is possible only to a being who has experience of an objective realm. He finds intimations of this thesis in the transcendental deduction and arguments for it. He endorses in the refutation of idealism and the second analogy. Studying these arguments, judging to what extent they are Kantian, determining whether they succeed, and trying to do better than Bennett if one can, are among the invigorating challenge of reading this book. Preface. This book concerns the first half of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, a treatment of the second half under the title Kant's Dialectic. Is in preparation. The present work ought to be readable by those who know nothing of the critic. It is in some sense an introduction, but a selective one which does not expound all the critic's most important themes. What I hope it provides is one fairly unified way of viewing a good part of Kant's achievement. To this end, I have freely criticized, clarified, interpolated, and revised. I make no apology for adopting this approach, for fighting Kant tooth and nail. Had I instead indulged him, or even given him the benefit of every doubt, I could neither have learned from his opaque masterpiece nor reported intelligibly on what it says. Like all great pioneering works in philosophy, the critic is full of mistakes and confusions. It is a misunderstanding to think that a supreme philosopher cannot have erred badly and often. The critic still has much to teach us, but it is wrong on nearly every page. I have no feelings about the man Immanuel Kant, and in my exploration of his work I have no room for notions like those of charity, sympathy, deference or hostility. Because I aim to be clear, yet fairly brief, I devote little space to acknowledging depths and pursuing these disagreements with previous writers on the critique. I am indeed somewhat out of sympathy with such of these as I have read, but I have learned from the works of Bird, Ewing, Kemp, Smith, Corner, Walsh, Weldon, and Wolff, more than by comparative silence about them might suggest. I have with difficulty checked Kemp Smith's translation of every passage quoted from the critic. I do not italicize the phrases a priori and a posteriori. My few other departures from Kemp Smith are noted as they occur. Following standard practice, I refer to the first edition of the critic as A and the second as B. The present work was written in 3 large parts, and then early in the rewriting divided into 54 sections. At the last minute, I have imposed a division into chapters. This was not part of my original plan, and I have not adjusted the text to accommodate it. Still, the chapter titles are roughly accurate and could help a reader who wishes to find whether and where I have discussed this or that large Kantian theme. The analytical table of contents read in conjunction with the text may help readers to grasp the book's main lines of argument and exposition. The notes at the end place every passage quoted or mentioned in the text, and refer to backing for assertions in the text about the views of Kant and others. The notes contain nothing of any other kind. The few page references given in the text are repeated in the notes, so that the latter provide a complete list of passages referred to. Drafts of some or all the works have been read and helpfully criticized by A. G. Ayer, Malcolm Budd, Ann Budder, A. C. Ewing, John Kenyon, M. G. Scott Taggart, P. F. Strawson, W. H. Walsh, and R. C. Siddings. And for throughout criticism or late drafts, I owe a special debt to Gillian Bennett, Ian Hacking, and Michael Tanner. I'm also grateful to Saul Steinberg for his commentary on the uneasy relationship between the a priori and the empirical, which appears as the frontispiece. Analytical table of contents. Static. Synthetic a priori judgments. 1. The place of the static in the critic. The critic has two parts of unequal size and merit: the transcendental doctrine of elements, and less than a quarter as long, the transcendental doctrine of method. The former is our main concern. The main division within the elements is into the aesthetic and the logic. For Kant, aesthetic considerations are ones pertaining in our senses to what we see, hear, feel, taste, and smell, and have nothing to do with the artistic question, which will be called aesthetic. Logic for Kant comprises all matters which might be called intellectual, such as the assessing of evidence, the drawing of conclusions, and the spotting of inconsistencies. The aesthetic is a tiny fragment of the elements and has no important divisions within it. The logic divides into the analytic and the dialectic. In the analytic, Kant undertakes to describe how the intellect works when it is on its best behavior. In the dialectic, he treats on certain misuses of the intellect and of the bad metaphysics arising therefrom. The two are related somewhat as physiology to clinical medicine. The analytic in turn divides into the analytic of concepts and the analytic of principles, a division which I shall explain later. The overall picture then is like this. 3 elements: aesthetic, logic, analytic, dialectic. Analytic of concepts, analytic of principles. 3 of the italicized items on this chart corresponds to the 3 parts of the present work. The 4th dialectic will be the topic of a further book. The chart puts the aesthetic on a level with the logic, and this is misleading. Not only in the aesthetic vastly smaller, but also it relates in a quite different way to its nominal subject matter. The logic is a direct assault on various philosophical problems concerning the intellect, while the aesthetic centrates on problems not about the sense, but about space and time. The aesthetic and the logic are nevertheless put on a pair by Kant because he thinks that is involving his problems about space and time. He can prove something about the senses analogous to something which he thinks the logic proves about the intellect. Consider it as a source of cogent, detailed argument from true premises to interesting conclusions. The aesthetic is not impressive, and yet I will make a case for discussing it at length. Kant has a natural subliminal sensitivity to philosophical problems, so that even where he argues badly, his writing is rich in hints and suggestions which can lead one to insights which Kant himself did not have. Moreover, attention to Kant's treatment of his problems about space and time is required for an understanding of the more mature and fruitful powers of the critic. The transcendental doctrine of method consists in rambling repetitions of material in the elements, plus an exposition of Kant's views about geometrical method, views which, through ingenious, have been revealed by later work on the philosophy and logic of mathematics as thoroughly and tiresomely wrong. This part of the critic clearly owes its existence to Kant's belief that it ought to exist rather than to the intellectual pressure of anything he has to say in it. It is announced ambitiously, we shall have to treat of a discipline, a canon, an architectonic, and finally a history of pure reason. And sure enough, there are 4 chapters whose perspective lengths are 86, 37, 20, and 5 pages. I shall sometimes quote from the method part of the critic, but I shall not discuss it as a whole. 2. Analytic and synthetic. The central arguments of the aesthetic depends upon Kant's use of the terms analytic and synthetic. He uses them to mark off what he calls 2 kinds of judgment and what I shall call 2 ways of constructing declarative sentences. If we construe a sentence as analytic, we are taking it as adding nothing to the predicate, to the concept of the subject, but merely breaking it up into those constituent concepts that have all along been thought in it, although confusedly. For example, all bodies are extended is taken by Kant as analytic because I do not require to go beyond the concept which I connect with body in order to find extension as bound up with it, to meet with this predicate. I have merely to analyze the concept of body, that is, to become conscious to myself of the manifold which I always think in that concept. A sentence is taken as synthetic if it's taken to add to the concept of the subject a predicate which has not been in any wise thought in it, and which no analysis could possibly extract from it. For example, when I say all bodies are heavy, the predicate is something quite different from anything that I think in the mere concept of body in general, and the addition of such a predicate therefore yields a synthetic judgment. Kant seems to overlook the possibility that a sentence might properly be taken either as analytic or as synthetic, depending on which of 2 equally standard meanings is attached to one of its terms. His analytic synthetic distinction between 2 kinds of judgment amounts, in fact, to an uneasy mixture of a distinction between 2 ways of constructing declarative sentences, and b. a distinction between 2 sorts of declarative sentence. I shall try to explain this. The distinction between self-handed and right-handed uses of tennis rackets does not divide tennis rackets themselves, for any racket can be used in either way. As against this, the line between left and right-handed uses of golf clubs is also a line between left and right-handed golf clubs. Kant seems to intend the analytic synthetic distinction to divide sentences, as the left-right distinction divides golf clubs. Presumably, he does not think it impossible that there should be a sentence which is sometimes construed as analytic and sometimes construed as synthetic. But he seems to think that there are in fact no such sentence or none worth mentioning. A sentence can be called analytic then, in the way in which a racket could be called right-handed if it were our custom never to permit any racket to be used sometimes right-handedly and sometimes left-handedly. Kant will not doubt reply that what he calls analytic are not sentences but judgments, and that a judgment is indeed either always analytic or always synthetic. If a sentence can be construed either analytically or synthetically, he will say, this just means that it can express more than one judgment. There is no condemnation of my procedures in this, but there is. If judgment is to be used like that, then expressions of the form the judgment that will refer unambiguously to a single judgment only if the sentence in the blank admits of only one moral construction, just as questions of the form is this sentence analytic may have to be answered by sometimes yes, sometimes no. No questions of the form is the judgment that analytic may have to be answered by for one of the judgment to which you have referred yes, for the other no. Kant shows no awareness of this possibility. I shall sometimes follow Kant in speaking of judgments as analytic or synthetic. When I say the judgment that all bodies are extended is analytic, I shall mean the sentence, all bodies are extended, is when construed by in any normal way analytic. But I shall not assume, as Kant seems to, that every sentence can be described either as analytic, in example, always construed analytical in ordinary discourse, or as synthetic, in example, always construed synthetically in ordinary discourse. This will limit my use of the judgment that, for example, I may not use the expression the judgment that what a man does voluntarily is always what he wants to do, because I think that want is in ordinary parlance ambiguous and in such a way that the sentence what a man does voluntarily is always what he wants to do can properly be used to say something which is true by virtue of the meanings attached to the words, and can equally properly be used to say something which is simply false. Thus the phrase the judgment that what a man voluntarily does is always what he wants to do does not uniquely refers to a single judgment. There is another snag in Kant's account of the analytic synthetic distinction. He says in effect that a judgment is analytic if and only if it is true solely by virtue of the concepts it involves, which I take as a shorthand for a sentence is analytic if and only if on its normal construction it says something true solely by virtue of the meanings of its constituent terms. It follows that self-contradictory judgments are not analytic, for they are not true by virtue of concepts or of anything else. Are they then synthetic? If we take Kant literally, they are, in its normal meaning, this sentence as all squared are circular is taken to add to the concept of the subject a predicate which has not been in any wise thought in it, and which no analysis could possibly extract from it, which is Kant's formula for a synthetic judgment. This is just an oversight, for Kant certainly intends analytic judgments to comprise only those which are true solely because of the concepts they involve, and synthetic judgments to comprise only those which cannot be determined by purely conceptual considerations, either as true or as false. He thus needs a third class of judgments, namely those which are false by virtue of the concepts they contain. This third class is squeezed out of Kant's account because he wants a classification of judgments which might be judged or judged or thought to be true. And he tends, I think, to assume that no one could think to be true something which was in fact false by virtue of the concepts involved. This mistake, thoroughly important in itself, is a symptom of a major and very insidious defect in Kant's account of the analytic synthetic distinction, namely the psychological terms in which he states it. Kant implies that the way to discover whether one construes a sentence of the form all Fs are G analytically is to think the concept associated with the subject, and to note whether in so doing one also thinks the concept associated with the predicate. This introspectionist account of the examination of meanings encourages Kant to restrict the label analytic to such sentences as are obviously trivially self-evidently analytic. For example, he says of a certain theorem about triangles that it is not analytic because to discover that it is true, I must not restrict my attention to what I am actually thinking in my concept of a triangle. This is nothing more than the mere definition. I must pass beyond it to properties which are not contained in this concept, but yet belong to it. The references here to the mere definition, to what is contained in a concept, and to what I am actually thinking, also suggest a restriction to what one will first think of when asked what triangle means, or to what one might first say when asked to explain what it means. A theorem about triangles, it seems it to count as analytic only if it is true by definition, true in such a way that someone could not doubt it if he knew the meanings of the relevant words. Also, the concept of the sum of 7 and 5 contains nothing save the union of the two numbers into one. And in this, no thought is being taken as to what that single number may be which combines both. The concept of 12 is by no means already thought in merely thinking this union of 7 and 5, and I may analyze my concept of such a possible sum as long as I please, still I shall never find the 12 in it. That the straight line between 2 points is the shortest is a synthetic proposition, for my concept of straight contains nothing of quantity but only of quality. The concept of the shortest is wholly as addition and cannot be derived through any process of analysis from the concept of the straight line. In each of the passages, Kant concludes from the most casual of premises that analytic procedures cannot yield a certain result, given the complexity which such procedures may have, and the novelty of the results which may be proved by them. Is this not rash? It is, unless we take any process of analysis to refer only to the scrutiny of what goes on in one's mind when one thinks a concept. This narrowing of analytic to something like true by definition is like the introspectionist account of meaning, which helps to generate it, contrary to Kant's own considered intentions. He takes the analytic synthetic distinction to divide two radically different ways in which judgments can be shown to be true. In his paradigmatic picture of what it is to show that a judgment is analytic, the judgment's true is shown to stem from the definitions of the words which express it, or from facts about what first comes to mind when we consider what those words mean, but from a judgment which is in this way self-evidently true or true by definition, we may derive by steps whose validity is warranted by elementary facts about meaning, a conclusion which is not self-evident or true by definition. In proving such a conclusion, we use the name means, as in showing that something expresses a self-evident or definitional or merely verbal truth. For in each case, we merely attend to the meaning of words. Kant nowhere suggests that he gives any theoretical weight to the difference between simple and complex, or short and long, investigations of meanings. On the contrary, he repeatedly says that a synthetic judgment is one those true cannot be derived from concepts, or whose predicate no analysis could possibly extract from the subject, because it is not contained even covertly in the subject. Consider this passage. No doubt the concept of right, in its common sense usage contains all that the subtlest speculation can develop out of it. True, though in its ordinary and practical use we are not conscious of the manifold representation comprised in this thought. Here the concept is described as thought, but it is allowed to contain more than we are conscious of its containings. There is no room here for an equation of the analytic with the trivial. So we have a problem. Kant denies that the theorems of Euclid's geometry are analytic. Do we take this as saying that they cannot be verified by purely conceptual means, or only that they are not true by definition in a quite narrow way? To see what makes this problem important, we must examine two more of Kant's technical terms. Three, a priori and a posteriori. A priori and a posteriori are among Kant's hardest worked technical terms. His use of them is complex and many layered, but all we need at this stage is the division of judgments into a priori and a posteriori on the basis of what the risk a judgment runs of being falsified by experience. Necessity and strict universality, says Kant, are sure criteria of a priori knowledge. The context clearly implies that necessity and universality are entailed by a priori as well as entailing it. Thus, if the judgment that all Fs are G is a priori, then experience cannot render it false by yielding even a single F which is not G. If it is a posteriori, then it could be falsified by experience. The exegesis of the aesthetic is largely an inquiry into the role which the words cannot and could and their cognates play in Kant's account of a posteriori and a priority and a posteriority. It may be noted at once, however, that Kant counts as a posteriori many judgments for which we have never found and are confident we never shall find a counter instance. For example, the judgment that every human body is larger than any ant will be described by Kant as a posteriori. The cannot, through which a priori is explained as to be stronger than that arising from fatally against what we have so far discovered about how the world works. Analytic judgments are all a posteriori, and for them at least a suitably strong sense of cannot is available. If all bodies are extended is analytic, then we may say there cannot be a body which is not extended, on the grounds that are the meanings of the relevant terms do not allow a body which is not extended as a consistent phrase whose realization can be expected, feared, hoped for, or theorized about, while body and extended have the meanings which renders all body are extended. Analytic, which renders all body are extended. Analytic, the impossibility of there being a body which is not extended is guaranteed by conceptual considerations and is on the face of it of a quite different kind from the impossibility of an occurrence with which thought consistently describable is ruled out by well-tested scientific hypotheses. Of course, an analytic sentence may come to express something false for one or more of the words it may change its meaning, but in that case the judgment or proposition expressed by the sentence will not be the one now expressed by it, and it is this judgment or proposition which is declared to be a priori, in example, incapable of refutation at the hands of experience. Powerful arguments have been adduced by Queenie and can be extracted from Wittgenstein, from saying that there is no sharp distinction between what a word means and what it in fact applies to, and from these two consequences follow: A. The analytic syntactic distinction is not sharp either, for analytic sentences are defined as ones which say something true solely by virtue of what their words mean, and not at all by virtue of the facts about the things their words apply to. B. The a priori a posteriori distinction is not sharp either, for a priori judgments are defined as ones which cannot turn out to be false, so that an a priori judgment must be expressed by a sentence which cannot come to say something false except by coming to express a judgment other than the one it now expresses, in example, except by changing its meaning. The view of Quine and Wittgenstein, however, is that there is no sharp line between the case where we move from saying it is the case that S to saying it is not the case that S, because we have come to mean something different by S, and the case where we make this move because we have changed our minds as to the facts. There is much force in this, but it does not dissolve the problem which Kant creates for us when he says that some judgments are at once synthetic and a priori. I take this to mean that a sentence may express a judgment, one, whose truth does not derive solely from the meanings of the words in the sentence, but two, which cannot be rendered false by experience. Even if there is little point in saying that a sentence is analytic or that is expressed as an a priori judgment, a matter to which I shall return at the end of 15, I think Quine will agree that insofar as analytic and expressing an a priori judgment have any intelligible use, they go together. It is just this which Kant denies. In saying that every analytic judgment is a priori, Kant will presumably have the agreement of everyone who has any use of the expressions analytic and a priori. If every synthetic judgment were a posteriori, then the two ways of classifying judgments will coincide. I believe that they do coincide insofar as one can see how they work at all, but Kant thinks that some judgments are at once synthetic and a posteriori. In example, that some sentences can be construed both as synthetic and on the same construction as expressing something whose refutation by experience is, in a suitable strong sense, impossible. This commits him to finding for impossible a sense which is a stronger than that of flatly against what we have so far discovered about how the world works, and b other than that of ruled out by the meanings of the words involved. For a judgment is a priori only if its refutation is impossible in a sense which satisfies A, and is synthetic only if its refutation is impossible in a sentence which satisfies B. It is because I cannot find for impossible a sense satisfying both A and B that I deny that any judgment can be both synthetic and a posteriori. Kant is acutely conscious of the attractiveness of the view that one cannot say something synthetic except at the price of saying something which could be refuted by experience. He therefore sees it as a major problem to show how it is possible for a judgment to be at once synthetic and a priori. He asks how it is possible because he does not doubt that some judgments, including those expressed by Euclid's theorem, are both synthetics and a priori. His most famous formulation of the problem first appeared in his Prolegomena and was then incorporated in the second edition of the Critic, but the problem itself dominates the aesthetic in both editions, as well as asking what risk of refutation a judgment runs. We may ask that what grounds there can be for thinking it to be true. In addition to might you be wrong, there is how do you know? Kant raises the question of the grounds for a judgment by putting with great force the case against synthetic a priori judgments. When we make a judgment in which the relation of a subject to the predicate is thought, we assert a connection between two concepts. Kant implies that we can fairly ask of any such judgment what connects those two concepts in the way that judgment says they are connected. If the judgment is analytic, the answer is easy. Triangularity is linked with sideness, as required by the judgment that all triangles are straight-sided, because the latter concept is a part of the former. Strictly speaking, we should not ask what links this concept with this other concept, for straight-sidedness, although it is not the same concept as triangularity, but only part of it, is not another concept than triangularity. Here in Kant's words, the connection of the predicate with the concept is thought through identity. With synthetic a posteriori judgments, there is also a straightforward answer. Then we judge that all sugar cubes are soluble in water. We assert a connection between two concepts because our past experience has connected instances of them. We have found many soluble sugar cubes and no insoluble ones. This connects the two concepts by a brute force link, so to speak, which is known to hold for instances which we have put to the test, and in conjecture to hold for all instances whatsoever. When Kant calls such a judgment a posteriori, he means that it is based upon individual items of past experience and what he rightly takes to be consequence of this, that it is vulnerable to individual items of future experience. The problem of how a judgment can be synthetic and a priori then presents itself to Kant as the problem of how two concepts, neither of which includes the other, can be connected in a way which does not rest upon past experience and is not vulnerable to future experience. This talk of a concept which includes another, and of judgments in which the connection of the predicate with the subject is thought through identity, echoes ominously Kant's narrowing approach to analyticity. It suggests that he is asking how a judgment can be a priori without being true by definition, or trivial or elementarily analytic. But we have an answer to that question. A judgment can be a priori, although not definitionally true, just so long as its true is guaranteed by purely conceptual considerations. I do not think that this is Kant's problem, however. The solution which he offers looks like an attempt to show of certain judgments that they are a priori, although their truth is not guaranteed by conceptual considerations of any sort whatsoever. An example may help to make this clear. Four, a geometrical experiment. Consider the case of someone who undertakes to test Pythagoras' theorem. He cuts out of a sheet of three-ply wood of triangular pieces, one of whose angles is a right angle. He tests this for triangularity by counting its sides and testing them for straightness, and for rectangularity by cutting out three congruent pieces and seeing that the four together exactly fill 360 degrees. He next cuts out three cardboard squares of different sizes, each one with sides of the same length as one side of his triangle. Pythagoras' theorem tells him that if this triangle is right angled, then the square of its longest side is equal to the sum of the squares on its other two sides. He proceeds to test this and finds that the two smaller squares, when dismembered and reassembled, cover the largest square with some to spare. He will probably take it that he has made some mistake, but suppose that he retests his piece of wood for triangularity and rectangularity, and retests his cardboard pieces for squareness and for equality of side with the sides of the triangle. Suppose also that other people conduct this test as well with the same results, and that the careful use of witnesses and of a cine camera yields no evidence that any of the experimental materials have changed in size or shape during the relevant times. Logically, this supposition is unexceptionable. Each successive action and result is logically possible, and a sequence of logically possible sub-stories which have no temporal overlaps constitutes a logically possible story. Our experiment then has to face the fact that a triangle was carefully tested for rectangularity and for the Pythagorean property that is passed the first test and failed the second, and that all attempts to find a specific mistake in either test have failed. Should he then claim to have found a counter instance to Pythagoras' theorem? This conclusion seems to be right if the theorem is constructed as a posteriori an example, as being in principle vulnerable to refutation. The experimenter may construe the theorem in this way and fan off the conclusion that he has refuted it. By insisting that something must have been wrong with the techniques or materials of the experiment, and attributing to abnormally bad luck his failure to discover what. But if he puts too much strains on bad luck, he will cease to be a scientist. If the experiment has the same result every time it is performed, however nicely, and if he can find no viable hypothesis as to what has gone wrong, the time will come when it is more reasonable to say this is a right angled triangle which is not Pythagorean, than to persist stubbornly in saying it is only because of mistaken techniques or some subtle instability in the materials that this test seems to show that the thing is a right-angled triangle and is non-Pythagorean. I still think that it is not both. There is, however, a way in which the experimenter can save the theorem without postulating a lurking defect in the conduct of or materials of the experiment. For he may construe the theorem as elementary analytic or true by definition. In that case, he will say that his tests, even if flawlessly conducted, were not sufficient to show conclusively that an angle is a right angle, that something is square, that two lines are of equal length, etc. He'll regard the question of whether he has constructed a right-angled triangle with squares on its sides as necessarily an open one until he discovers whether two of the squares are equal to the third. It is part of what I mean by right-angled triangle. He will say that a right-angled triangle has the Pythagorean property. To think that a test could refute the theorem as like thinking that a test could show that a triangle need not have three sides. Kant is surely right in rejecting this account of a theorem like that of Pythagoras, but when he says that such theorems are synthetic, is this all that he is rejecting? If it were, then his claim that there are synthetic and a priori truths would amount only to saying that the experimenter has a third option open to him, namely taking the theorem to be true, despite the outcome of the rest, because it is analytic thought, not elementary. So if the experimenter had a set of definitions from which the theorem followed by steps whose validity was elementarily analytic, then he would have grounds for maintaining that his experiment could not have refuted the theorem. He might also have grounds for changing some of his definitions, but that leads to into Quinian areas which are not relevant to my present point. He will be wrong, or at least eccentric, in his use of geometrical terms, were such as to justify him in taking this opinion. In example, in declaring the theorem to be analytic thought, not elementarily so, but at least his position will be an intelligible one. Unfortunately, Kant's treatment of the alleged a priority of Euclidean geometry seems not to admit of this interpretation. His explanation of how there can be judgments which are both synthetic and a priori is offered as an account of certain limits upon what can be sensorily encountered in the physical world, rather than saying that the theorem could be saved from the experiment without being taken as true by definition. Kant seems to say that the experiment simply could not happen. This could not is to have a warrant stronger than could be supplied by empirical science, but is not to arise from conceptual considerations of any kind. Thus we are back with our problem. Through most of my next 4 sections, I shall construe Kant's account of synthetic and a priori judgments in that spirit, steering clear of any interpretation of it as an attempt to show how a judgment can be, or to show that certain specific judgments are a priori without being elementarily analytic. Nevertheless, the narrowing approach to analyticity must not be forgotten, for from its themes, Kant's perfect confidence that some judgments are synthetic and a priori. It is also the roof of the once popular belief that if there were no synthetic a priori judgments, the sciences of logic and mathematics will be either trivial or empirical. More important, I shall show in 1115 that Kant's solution can be so interpreted as to constitute, after all, an argument for saying of certain judgments that they are true because of certain very complex and unobvious conceptual facts. I doubt if this interpretation is true to Kant's conscious intentions, and this is one good reason for suppressing it until we have explored the other interpretation, which takes Kant to be arguing that certain judgments are a priori although they are not supported by conceptual facts of any kind. Two, the outer sense theory. 5. The form of outer sense Kant uses the word sensibility for one's capacity for being in any sort of sensory state. He says that this capacity is exercised in two ways. As outer sense, it permits one to have sensory states which are seeing, hearings, feelings, etc. of things other than oneself. As inner sense, it permits one to have sensory states which may relate to one's environment but may be just states of oneself. Thus, all sensory states are mediated by inner sense and some by outer sense as well. Notwithstanding, one queer remark suggesting the contrary. The proper contrast is not being outer and inner, but between outer and also inner, and only inner, as Kant says. Whatever the origin of our sensory states, whether they are due to the influence of outer things or are produced through inner causes, they must all, as modifications of the mid, belong to inner sense. Our present concern is with outer sense. All in the variety of my sensory awareness of the world, there is, according to Kant, the constant factor that every one of these states of awareness is the end product of a transaction between my sensibility and some part of the world outside me. Wherever and whenever it occurs, whatever fragment of the varied world of the world it confronts with me, any outer sensory state is given to me by my sensibility in its function as outer sense. This suggests that there might be some features which characterize all my experiences of the world, not because of any uniformity in the world, but rather because my outer sense imposes these features upon its entire output. Kant says that this is indeed the case. Specifically, the outer sense of every human is such as to guarantee that the outer world which he experiences will always conform to the theorems of Euclidean geometry. This being construed, we must add synthetically. Regarding the geometrical experiment described in the preceding section, Kant will presumably say that although such a sequence of observations can be described without logical inconsistency, its occurrence is ruled out by the modus operandi of the human outer sense. Here is an analog of Kant's doctrine of outer sense. I do not know who is going to play my piano this evening, whether it will be played by someone skilled or unskilled, with good or bad musical tastes, aiming to please or to annoy. Nevertheless, I do know that the piano is built in such a way that it can make only sounds which have the timbre characteristics of pianos, and not the timbre of flutes, pneumatic drills, or crying babies. Here potential pianist correspond to the world, and the piano corresponds to outer sense. In each case, the end product arises from a transaction between a varying world or pianist and a constant sensibility or piano, and so it has variety and also certain constant and absolutely dependable features. Those features of outer experience which vary with the world are described by Kant as the matter of experience. The invariant features which outer sense imposes upon experience are the latter's form. Analogously, we might say that a recital had the formal property of consisting entirely of piano sounds and the material property of including a Beethoven sonata. 6. The status of Kant's theory. We now have the outlines of a theory which invites us to place unqualified reliance on Euclid's axioms on the grounds that outer sense will not permit our experience on the outer world to reach us in such a form that the outer world is perceived to be non-Euclidean. The question now arises: what does Kant think the logical and epistemological status in his theory to be? On his own showing, there are just three possible answers. First, the theory is synthetic and a posteriori, which is to say that it has the force of outer sense, has to until now imposed a Euclid confirming form of all its output, and we may reasonably expect it to continue to do so. This answer is not available to Kant. If outer sense could cease to impose a Euclid confirming form on our outer experience, then Euclid's geometry could cease to be true on the experienced outer world, which is just to say that it is not a priori after all. If Kant renders this theory vulnerable to experience, then this vulnerability is transmitted to Euclidean geometry, and that he cannot allow. 2. The theory is a priori because it is analytic. If the theory is taken to be elementarily analytic or true by definition, then it has the force to qualify for the title outer sense. A mode of sensibility must be imposed a Euclid confirming form upon its output, and this is unacceptable for the following reason. Kant's concern is with the judgment that all outer experience, meaning experience of something other than oneself, is experience of something Euclidean. If he so defines outer sense, that what is given to us by outer sense must be Euclid confirming. Then we must divorce the meaning of outer experience from that of outer sense in such a way as to allow that outer experience needs to come to us through outer sense, and in that case the outer sense theory is irrelevant to the question at issue. Alternatively, the theory might be said to be analytic, though not true by definition. To demonstrate this, however, Kant will have to trace a conceptual route from outer to Euclidean, and he makes no attempts to do so. I shall argue later that what is outer is spatial, is analytic though not elementarily so, and Kant seems to assume that what is spatial is Euclidean, is analytic. But even if he were right about this, and were therefore entitled to take what is outer is Euclidean to be analytic, how could this help to explain Euclidean geometry's supposed status as a priori and synthetic? Kant does just one seems to take it as analytic, and indeed as true by definition. That what is outer spatial. He speaks of sensations and being referred to something outside me, that is, to something in another region of space from that in which I find myself. This aside does not represent his considerate view, and in any case it could not help him over the status of the outer sense theory. 3. The remaining option is to say that the theory is itself both synthetic and a priori, where 1 and 2 each say something clear but prejudicial to the status Kant claims for Euclid's theorems. This third option preserves that status, perhaps, but it is itself quite obscure. Having seen the difficulty about synthetic and a priori judgments, Kant has offered to show that there can be such judgments and that their possibility is explained by an underlying theory of outer sense. But now we are told that this theory is itself synthetic and a priori. Our original problem now arises at a new level. The outer sense theory cannot explain its own status as synthetic and a priori, and so this status must be explained by some further theory which relates to the outer sense theory, as the latter allegedly does to Euclidean geometry. Kant does not say or even ask what this further theory might be. I press this question of the theory status because until we know whether the theory is to be taken as analytic or synthetic, a priori or a posteriori, we do not know what sorts of arguments might be relevant to its truth. That the piano will make sounds of a certain timbre is a posteriori truth based upon knowledge of the workings of the piano. But what could count as knowledge of the workings of outer sense? Kant cannot take outer sense to be some part of the nervous system and base his theory upon neurophysiology, for he is emphatic that the science of human bodies could yield only a posteriori results. He does in fact think that a priority is in a peculiar way involved in true scientific hypotheses, but he denies that empirical inquiries can show us that any particular scientific hypothesis is a priori. Yet he demands of the outer sense theory that it should not obtain favor merely as a plausible hypothesis, but should have that certainty and freedom from doubt which is required of any theory, that is to serve as an organon, and that it should be not merely possible or probable, but indubitable certain. The piano analogy is at best a sparsely formal one. Then, Kant does not discuss the status of the outer sense theory, and his only serious argument for its truth goes so wide of the mark that it gives no intimation of how he might have tackled the status problem. Since the propositions of geometry are synthetic a priori, I raise the question, whence do you obtain such propositions, and upon what does the understanding rely in its endeavor to achieve such absolutely necessary and universally valid truths? The only possible answer, he says, is that the understanding relies on the fact to which the outer sense theory draws attention. This argument is without value, even if nothing but the outer sense theory could explain Euclidean geometries having the status Kant thinks it has. It does not follow that the theory is true unless we have the further premise that Euclidean geometry is synthetic and a priori. This premise is indeed among Kant's unargued assumptions and motivates his search for an explanation of how there can be synthetic and a priori truths. But he is not entitled to argue from it until he argues for it. Why Kant is so confident that there are synthetic a priori truths? Part of the answer, no doubt, lies in his tendency to equate synthetic with not true by definition, but there is an ambiguity in a priori which may also be relevant. Kant says, if we have a proposition which is being thought, is thought as necessary, it is an a priori judgment. This suggests that an a priori judgment is simply one which the judger believes to be invulnerable to experience. In this non-committal sense, I can describe a judgment made by someone else as a priori without myself asserting its invulnerability. Now Kant is apparently not aware of the distinction between weak and strong senses of a priori. In the following passage, he moves from the weak sense of to the strong through an expression which is ambiguous as between them. The italics are mine. If then a judgment is thought with strict universality, that is, in such manner that no exception is allowed as possible, it is not derived from experience but is valid absolutely a priori. Also, he has one explicit argument for the existence of synthetic a priori judgments, which seems to rest directly on the weak sense of a priori mathematics and physics. He says, since these sciences actually exist, it is quite proper to ask how they are possible. For that they must be possible is proven by the fact that they exist. He defends the claim that a priori physics exists in a footnote. Many may still have doubts as regards pure a priori natural science. We have only, however, to consider the various propositions that are to be found at the beginning of empirical physics, properly so called, those, for instance, relating to the permanence in the quantity of matter, to inertia, to the equality of action and reaction, etc., in order to be soon convinced that they constitute a physica pura. It is not clear that we are here invited to consider, but Kant seems to be appealing to the way in which physics is done, to the assumptions which physicists do in fact make and do not regard as open to experimental refutation. If this is how he is arguing, then he is using a priori in the non-committal sense. Nevertheless, he does not actually take a priori in this way, and if he did, the outer sense theory will be nugatory. In the weak sense of a priori, it is true enough that for many people Euclid's theorems are synthetic and a priori, but this means not only that such people have made a mistake, it need not and cannot be explained by a theory of outer sense. 7. Sensibility and sense organs. We have seen that Kant is debarred from identifying outer sense and what I have called the world with any such empirical items as sense organs and the world. What blocks him is not just his need for an a priori theory of outer sense, but also something else, which I shall now explain. Consider the sentence: all our perceptions of objects are caused by the objects perceived. I shall call this the causal theory of perception, and I offer it not as a version of the outer sense theory, but merely as an explanatory analog of it. The causal theory of perception might be defended as a barely legitimate way of saying something which is probably true. If someone stands open-eyed before an elephant and says that he sees an elephant, we shall probably not think of this as requiring casual explanation, but an explanation is called for if he reports seeing an elephant when there is none there. And we can explain the non-standard case only if we could on demand explain the standard case also. The actual incapacities of the leper, the distortions arising from selective deafness, color blindness, these and their like can already in some measure be causally explained, and it may well be that every such sensory failure and every sensory success could in principle be explained through well-established scientific hypotheses which connect sensory states with the physical conditions of human bodies and their environments, since the explanation of any sensory success must refer to the thing seen, the sound heard, the surface touched, etc. This could be summed up loosely in the sentence: all our perceptions of objects are caused by the objects perceived. The causal theory of perception, then, may merely express a worthy optimism about such sciences as optics and neurophysiology. Of several other ways in which the causal theory of perception might be construed, I shall consider only the one which Locke adopted. Locke noted that most of our experience does, some does not, fall into certain kinds of complex patterns without which we shall have no reason to take any of our sensory states to be perceptions of objects. This very general fact seems to Locke to need explanation. If I turn my eye at noon towards the sun, I cannot avoid the ideas which the light or sun then produces in me, so that there is a manifest difference between the ideas laid up in my memory and those which force themselves upon me, and I cannot avoid having, and therefore it must needs be some exterior cause, and the brisk action of some objects without me, whose efficacy I cannot resist, and produces those ideas in my mind, whether I will or not. This too might be summed up by: all our perceptions of objects are caused by the objects perceived. But so taking the causal theory of perception pretends to explain a certain general fact by pointing to facts which are just parts of the one to be explained. An example may help to make this clear. In explaining the fact that Smith has at this moment a heterogeneous visual field, we may properly refer to the fact that things have various colors. Just because the explanation might have been Smith has glass eyes, which are stimulating his optic nerves in such a way that, etc. Or Smith is in darkness, but radiation is affecting his eyes in such a way that, etc. It is significant and informative to say that the explanation is: Smith has normal eyes which are now open. He is in daylight, and he is confronted by things which have various colors. But in explaining the fact that people sometimes have heterogeneous visual fields, we cannot refer to the fact that the world is variocolored, for this is part of the explicandum. If there were no heterogeneous visual fields, there would be no reason to say that things have various colors. One may explain that the heterogeneity in terms of length of light waves, and perhaps someone might use his own eyes to establish that the world is variocolored, and then use this to explain the heterogeneity of the visual fields of others. But the former explanation avoids circularity only because it does not appeal to the world's being variocolored, and the latter is legitimate, if at all, only because its explicandum omits one set of facts about visual heterogeneity. The causal theory of perception is similarly defective if it purports to explain why there is order in our experience by appealing to how objects act upon us. It might explain why there is order in the experience of all children or of all scientists, or more dubiously of everyone but him who offers the explanation, but it cannot explain the perfectly general fact that there is ordered experience, because that includes as a special case everything that might be said about objects in the supposed explanation. One cannot can no more move from physics and neurophysiology to the order in our experience that one can move from the world's color variety to the heterogeneity of our visual fields. In either case is there a move. The two cases also differ. While visual heterogeneity may be explained by reference to light waves, experiential order cannot be explained by any facts about objects, since all these are part of the explicandum. Taken only as expressing scientific optimism, the causal theory of perception escapes his attack by speaking of the whole of human experience only in a piecemeal way. It calls attention to the possibility of subjecting and given perception to experimental inquiry, and it need not deny that in such an inquiry some perceptions must be used and therefore cannot themselves be inquired into at that time by those experiments. The theory becomes objectionable only when, as in Locke's hands, it invites us to stand back from all the individual inquiries and to generalize and block about the relation between the two items, human experience and the world of objects. Kant intends the outer sense theory to be like this, which is the ultimate reason why he cannot construe it as a theory about empirical things of any sort whatever. Had it been put to him that outer sense might be an array of sense organs and nerves, Kant would certainly have replied that since empirical things are given to us only through outer sense, it will be absurd to identify any of them with outer sense. 8. Phenomena and noumena. Kant then will not have it that the outer sense theory is about empirical things. Probably he thinks it about noumena. Noumenon is best understood through the opposite term phenomenon. Kant applies this and the word appearance to all those objective things, processes and events which we can know about means of our senses, but not to our sensory states themselves. Physical objects are typical phenomena, but Kant will take phenomena to include battles, victories, rivers, genuine ghosts, and sky. I shall find it convenient to apply the adjective phenomenal to sensory states as well as to phenomena. We describe phenomena under such headings as states, taste, color, shape, size, position, texture, viscosity, temperature, smell, density, strength, edibility, audibility, solubility, biological classification, commercial utility, rarity, and thousands of others. And the basis for these descriptions is what we know by means of our senses. This does not imply that something can be described as a typewriter, say, on the basis of how it looks and regardless of how it functions. For the question of how it functions is also one which can be answered only on the basis of our senses. Kant thinks that statements about phenomena are not merely supported by, but are equivalent to, statements about actual and possible sensory states. Something might be the case although no one had any sensory evidence for it. But it is bad logic to say that something might be the case although there was nothing anyone could do which will yield sensory evidence for it. If someone says seriously, there is no moon, we may think he has some fancy about a permanent visual hallucination or a trick by the Martians. If he is not shaken by close-up photographs of the moon, it becomes harder to know what to make of him. Suppose, however, that after walking on the moon he says, I grant that the evidence so far, and perhaps all the evidence there could be, supports the lunar hypothesis, but there is no moon. We can no longer regard him as fanciful or skeptical, for now we do not understand what he says. We understood him just as long as we could guess at what sorts of evidence he believed could be found to support his position. Now that he admits that his thesis is not answerable to evidence at all, we do not even know that what his thesis is. Kant calls this account of statements about phenomena transcendental idealism. Transcendental because it is a thesis about beings, and idealism because of the primacy which it gives to sensory states. It must be sharply distinguished from empirical idealism, which, without reducing statements about non-mental items to ones about mental items, says that they are in fact only mental items. Whereas transcendental idealism offers an analysis of statements about tables and chairs, and empirical idealism denies that there are any tables and chairs. Realisms, too, divide into transcendental and empirical. Transcendental realism, which denies that non-mental statements reduce to mental ones, is realism because it gives to the concept of a non-mental item an irreducible place in our conceptual scheme, while empirical realism treats that there are no mental items in the world, such as G. E. Moore's hands. The empirical transcendental distinction may be seen at work in Kant's argument that a transcendental realist is not entitled to be an empirical realist as well. The transcendental realist, for whom there is always a logical gap between statements about non-mental things and statements about actual and possible experiences, cannot know for sure what there are any non-mental things, nor can he even reasonably believe that they are, for, as Kant says, in a different connection. I must never presume to opine without knowing at least something, by means of which the judgment in itself merely problematic secures connection with truth, a connection which, although not complete, is yet more than arbitrary fiction. Moreover, the law of such a connection must be certain, for if, in respect of this law also, I have nothing but opinion, it is all merely a play of the imagination without the least relation to truth. The transcendental realist may presume to opine that there are non-mental things on the grounds that if there were not, his experience would probably not be as it is. But he cannot know for sure that this is probable, and if he merely opines that it is, then he is well on the way to a play of the imagination without the least relation to truth. His empirical view, his view about what in fact there is in the world, ought to be not empirical realism, but more conscious empirical idealism. It is this transcendental realist who afterwards plays the part of empirical idealist, after wrongly supposing that objects of the sense, if they are not to be external, must have an existence by themselves and independently of the senses. He finds that judgment from this point of view and our sensory representations are inadequate to establish their reality. The transcendental idealist, on the other hand, takes they are non-mental things to say something about actual and possible experiences, and we know for sure that what it says, just so taken, is true. The transcendental idealist, Kant says, may be an empirical realist. In other words, if we have idealism in our conceptual background, we may have realism as our view of what there is. We now turn to noumena. A noumenon is anything which is not phenomenal. An example, which is not a sensory state and which cannot be known about through the senses. The things in themselves, of which Kant also speaks can for present purposes be equated with noumena. The relationship between them will be touched upon in 18. Kant must say that the sentence "there is a square noumenon" is without sense, because the only sort of meaning allowed by the definition of noumenon is forbidden by the transcendental idealist account of the meaning of square. Indeed, he thinks that there is almost nothing which can be meaningfully said about noumena. The definition of noumenon entitles us to assert noumena are not possible subjects of sensory encounter and the like, but apart from those licensed by its definition, every sentence containing noumenon is unintelligible. This is because Kant ties meaning so closely to evidence. To know what a sentence means, I must know something of what it would be like to have evidence for its truth. The notion of having evidence for Kant is essentially the notion of encountering a datum, of running up against a brute fact, or as Kant will say, of being given something. But whatever is given to us is given through our senses, and so cannot be relevant to any question about noumena. It follows that no synthetic sentence about noumena can be meaningful to us. A question as to the constitution of that something which cannot be thought through any determinate predicate, inasmuch as it is completely outside the sphere of those objects which can be given to us, is entirely null and void. Since we may not use noumenon even conjecturally or skeptically in any sentence except the analytic ones which define it, what use does Kant have for the term? Well, there are four answers to this. First, Kant's thesis is that noumena cannot occur in meaningful sentences of a theoretical or descriptive or fact-stating kind. There are, however, ways of talking and thinking about oneself which are not of this kind. I might describe what I do, but I also do what I do. I sometimes predict my future actions, but I can also decide what they are able to be. I am given to myself as an object of study, but I also am myself. Kant uses noumenon in connection with these ways in which I alone can regard myself. In Kant's dialectic, I shall discuss how far he is entitled to do so. Second, in a chapter on the distinction between phenomena and noumena, Kant speaks of the negative use of noumenon. I shall discuss his most interesting use of the word in 18. Third, Kant sometimes implies that noumena occurs in one sentence which is not just meaningful but true, namely they are noumena, as when he argues that since they are phenomena or appearances, we cannot deny that they are also noumena without being landed in the absurd conclusion that there can be appearance without anything that appears. This argument is specious in the sense in which empirical things are appearances, namely that statements about them can be wholly analyzed in experiential terms. It is not true that there must be something of which they are appearances. In fact, Kant's ostensible thesis is that in that passage is we can think noumena, which he takes obscurely to be weaker than noumena are possible, and so weaker than noumena exists. But if this is all he seeks to prove, then the allegedly absurd conclusion that there can be appearance without anything that appears ought to read be there can be appearance without it's being thinkable that there is something which appears. Apart from the fact that this is not what Kant says, why should anyone think that B is absurd except as a corollary of the alleged absurdity of A? To be discussable at all, the argument must be taken as an attempt to show that there are noumena, and so taken it is invalid. Similar lapses occur elsewhere. The true correlate of sensibility, the thing in itself, is not known, and a priori knowledge has to do only with appearances must leave the thing in itself as indeed real per se, but as not known by us, and there are some others. Kant has been said to argue that since our sensory states come to us unbidden, there must be some nominal cause of them distinct from ourselves. So much the worse the worse if he does, for the given must be given by something, is no better than appearances must be appearances of something. I cannot find this argument in the Critic, however. Kant does sanction a certain kind of talk about the intelligible nominal cause of appearances, but merely in order to have something corresponding to sensibility viewed as a perceptivity. But this offers us a picture only, not an argument. 4. Although Kant does not say so, it looks as thought, outer sense, and that with which it collaborates to produce outer experience cannot be phenomenal, can allows that there can be synthetic a priori truths about phenomena and appearances. Indeed, I have just quoted him as saying that synthetic a priori truths cannot be anything else, but then he says that he is assuming that the outer sense theory, a certain similar theories, and true and rise no problems as to their own status. Until he has some such theory actually established, Kant must say that there can be only a posteriori knowledge about phenomena. Also, there is the argument of 7, which might be summed up as follows. Kant rightly thinks that statements about phenomena are analyzable into statements about what experiences are bad or will be had if appropriate moves were made, and the outer sense theory cannot be embodied in statements of this sort, since it is supposed to show that certain kinds of experience are impossible, presumably that I must be about noumena. This for the outer sense theory is the last straw. The theory's troubles began with the insistence that it be synthetic as well as a priori. I introduced outer sense in 5 as a capacity for being sensorily affected in a certain way, but in 6 to 8 I have asked that what sort of things outer sense might be, and have been assuming that it must be something in the nature of a mechanism with a mode of operation and an intake of an output. This looks like a violent change of subject, for one does not ask of a mental capacity that sort of things it is, or whether it can be identified with this or that, or what is its mode of operation is. Nevertheless, this refining of outer sense was not mere caprice, for it was required if Kant's attempts to explain the synthetic and a priori status of geometry was be to give it a run for its money. Someone who has news for us about the outer experience may be offering an analysis of outer. That is, he may have arguments to show that the experience which is to count as experience of things other than oneself must satisfy certain conditions. The conclusion of such arguments might be called a theory of outer sense. In example, a theory about one's capacity for having experience of things other than oneself. But if someone says something about outer experience, such as that it must be of something Euclidean, and offer this as synthetic, then we must choose. By saying synthetic, he means either A, not true by definition, not elementarily analytic, or B, not to be established by investigating meanings. Having set aside interpretation A, I have persisted with B, and this is why I have had no demand that the outer sense theory to be something other than an analysis of outer. If justice is to be done to the claim that the outer sense theory is not based upon conceptual considerations, however subtle and complex, then must take it to be saying something about how outer experience comes into being. Such a genetic theory of outer experience requires a reified outer sense, and this inevitable must be nominal. Let us stop these troubles and their source by supposing Kant's theory to be synthetic, not in the strong sense, but only in the sense of not true by definition. This preserves us from the question, what sort of thing is outer sense? With its inevitable answer, a nominal sort of things. After some preliminaries in 9 to 10, I shall defend part of the outer sense theory by arguing that it is analytic but untrivial. This is not the only case where something which Kant offers as synthetic can be partly solved if it is reinterpreted as unobviously analytic. Such an interpretation is justified by its fruitfulness in leading us to philosophical insights, rather than by its fidelity to Kant's conscious intentions. There probably is no final answer to the question of whether Kant takes synthetic to mean merely not true by definition, not elementary analytic, though I incline to think that he does not. Nine. Spatiality and geometry. Why does Kant find it so obvious that Euclid's theorem construed synthetically cannot turn out false? I take it that Euclidean geometry is true, and if and only if there are physical interpretations of straight line, congruent and so under which Euclid's theorems constitute a true physical theory. It might be said that the failure to find such interpretations will not show that Euclid's theorems are untrue or of straight lines, right angles, etc., but will merely suggest that the physical world does not contain any straight lines, right angles, etc. This approach, however, is not open to Kant. For one thing, it involves defining straight line, right angle, and so on as items of which Euclid's axioms and postulates are true. This equates the truth of Euclidean geometry with its consistency, and so renders it either inconsistent or analytic. Also, since Kant explains the alleged a priority of Euclid's theorems in terms of how things are given to us, he must think that the theorems describe other things. The relationship between geometry and physics involves complexities of which Kant was not aware, but we must take him to be concerned with applied geometry. He cannot drive a wedge between Euclid's theorems are false, and there is no physical interpretation of Euclid's terms under which his theorems are true. It is prima facie possible that there should be no physical interpretation under which Euclidean geometry is true, and none under which any other geometry is true either. The bare denial of a geometry is not a geometry any more than the placing of, and it is not the case that in front of Newton's Principia yields a non-Newtonian physics. The experiment of Ford might reflect the fact not that the world obeys some non-Euclidean geometry, but rather that it does not exactly obey any geometry. In such a case, it might obey some geometry approximately or usually, but it might be such that no geometry gave anything like a true account of it. And if this were so, the world will, and if this were the world, and if this were so, the world will not be in any plain sense a special one. Kant says that Euclidean geometry is synthetic, which implies that its falsity is logically possible. It has been taken so to imply further that the truth of some non-Euclidean geometry is possible, and Kant has been congratulated to on this supposed insight. This is very odd. Hume, after all, went so far as to say that the received truths of geometry might be empirically falsified. But it is not usual, nor will it be sensible to credit him with anticipating the mathematical discovery that non-Euclidean geometries are possible. The truth of the matter is that before that discovery was made, an intelligent person could concede that Euclidean geometry might be false while thinking that if that were so, then no geometry could be precisely true. Even now, it is hard for the unmathematical to see what the next move could be after the conclusion of the Pythagorean refuting experiment. If Pythagoras' theorem is false, then we must relinquish at least one of the premises from which we can derive it. Obvious, simple premises such as that not two straight lines intersect twice, and what is going to happen then if we still persist in trying to develop an absolutely general theory about lines and points and the rest? Are we not bound to contradict ourselves somewhere? The answer, as the mathematicians have shown, is no, but this is extremely unobvious and is not equivalent to the fact that Euclidean geometry might be false. Someone who, like Kant, did not know that there can be consistent total geometries other than Euclid's will be confronted by a dilemma. Either A, the outer world is Euclidean, or B, the outer world does not conform to any geometry at all and is therefore not spatial. I shall argue in 1113 that B, although not elementarily self-contradictory, is ruled out on complex conceptual grounds. If Kant too regarded B as possible, he would have been left with A. I suggest that this may have been one source of his confidence in the a priority of Euclidean geometry. I cannot have been the only source, however. Even if it is true that the outer world must be spatial and so must obey a geometry, there are no grounds for insisting that it must obey a geometry exactly and always. Yet Kant is sure that we cannot meet with even a single failure of Euclid's theorems to describe the outer world accurately, as well as his excusable ignorance of the possibility of non-Euclidean geometries. Therefore, some additional mistake must be involved. I now suggest that mistake it is, and why can mistake, and why can makes it. Then, Euclidean geometry and A-side. Kant shares that preoccupation with the visual which has weakened and narrowed epistemology for centuries. Throughout the aesthetic, he virtually equates outer sense with A-side. This prevents him from considering such possible spaces as the purely auditory, on which I shall discuss shall discuss in 12:13, and it militates against his saying that even the space in which we live, to which a site is relevant, may not be perfectly Euclidean. The obsession with a site often goes with the belief that visual fields, unlike the other sensory states, are themselves spatial, as thought they were, in Wisdom's phrase, extremely thin colored pictures. The propensity for reifying sense data and describing them in terms appropriate to physical things, the stick is straight but the onlooker's sense datum is bent, involves depth of error which I need not plumb now. It is relevant, however, to consider the less absurd belief that visual fields have a specially intimate connection with the spatiality of the physical world. I stand on a hilltop and see that the stream is not to the left of the thicket, that the farmhouse is beyond the road, and so on. And I may think that my visual field, even if not itself spatially organized, does at least constitute evidence of a peculiarly direct kind as to the spatial organization of the things in the valley. In that sense, if any, it is true. I do not need a sight to discover how the things in the valley are disposed. A man blindfold could find out by stumbling down into the valley, feeling the road under his feet, the colliding with the farmhouse, and so on. He will steer primarily by touch and by his so-called kinesthetic sense. In example, his ability to know whether and how he is moving. So I too could check the evidence of my eyes by procedures involving movements and touch. Now, it could happen that my eyes told me a quite different story about the disposition of the valley's contents from that told me by my hands and feet. If such discrepancies occurred frequently and unpredictably, we could not give our spatial terminology as visual and a textual kinesthetic basis. Which basis should we choose? We are not conceptually forearmed for every possible eventuality, but we are for this one. If we had to choose between a visual and a textual kinesthetic basis for our spatial concepts, we should choose the latter. The reason for this is also the reason why textual kinesthetic considerations are now more central to our spatial concepts than our visual considerations, even though the two roughly coincide, since physical contact is involved in all the main ways in which things can hurt, soothe, nourish, or protect us. The where, which matters most in the textual kinesthetic where, which asks how to achieve or avoid physical contact. Visual fields are quick, reliable, and fairly comprehensive guides to the spatial relations amongst physical things, but they have this virtue only because they correlate with those textual and kinesthetic facts which lie at the heart of our concept by physical space. As Hume says, our sight informs us not of distance, immediately and without a certain reasoning and experience, as is acknowledged by the most rational philosophers. The most rational philosopher on this topic is Berkeley, whose new theory of vision presents in cogent detail the argument of this paragraph. There is then no reason for letting a side dominate our inquiries into spatial concepts, but I shall argue further that such a domination in the form which it usually takes in philosophical writing is positively dangerous. Sight is favored because it alone can give us, within a single moment, an expression of the spatial ordering of a sizable part of the world. The obsession with sight is especially an obsession with what can be seen at a glance. This is implicit in what I have said already, for visual fields have a specially intimate connection with the spatiality of the physical world. Is plausible only if it means that a single visual field, in example, a visual state at some one time relates to the world's spatiality in more directly than to other visual sensory states. Whereas I see at glance that the ticket is to the left of the stream, the blindfolded man must attend to his changing sensory states as he gropes across the valley. In moderate respects for the single visual field had led some writers to insist that visual space at least must be perfectly Euclidean. Ewing, for example, finds in Kant's position the residual truth that we have a total inability to see or imagine any except certain kinds of spatial construction, these Euclidean ones. He explicitly acknowledged the point I have been making. The italics are mine. I must admit that in considering these questions I have confined myself to visual space. None of the other sense give me a sufficiently definitive perception of any considerable extent of space at the same moment to enable me to answer the question in their case. If we restricted ourselves to what could be imagined or seen at a glance, then perhaps we should be bound to regard space as Euclidean. The experiment of 4 took me as, and perhaps we cannot imagine seeing at a glance, that something was, or probably was, a non-Pythagorean right-angled triangle. Again, we could discover the falsity of 2 straight lines intersect at most once, taken in any normal sense, which renders it synthetic, perhaps finding 2 routes from A to B, each passing every test for straightness. But it is not clear how one could see at a glance that 2 straight lines intersect twice. It seems that if both intersections are seen at once, then at least one of the lines must look curved. I am not sure that this is right, perhaps because I am not sure what I mean by must look curved. The main point, however, is this: even if it is true that nothing could look non-Euclidean, this is irrelevant to the censorious examination of spatial concepts, because single visual fields are only clues, by good luck rather reliable ones, to the spatial relations among things. If it were found that the wavelength of lights associated with various colors were such as to put blue closer to green than to purple, we might well say that this was a discovery not about colors but only about the wavelength associated with them, or perhaps not about visual colors but only about physical colors. This will have a point, because one can talk sensibly about colors without knowing anything about wavelengths. The language of colors or of visual colors has a life of its own. I think that some of Kant's defenders have wanted to say similarly that the scientists' hypotheses regarding physical geometry may be valid as science but do not touch the visual space, which is the only one the layman needs to attend to. This assumes that what can be seen at a glance provides for our special concepts as adequate basis, logically independent for other bases in the way that seem colors are logically independent of wavelengths. I have argued that this is a mistake. Single visual fields would be entirely relevant to ordinary spatial concepts if they were not correlated with what can be learned about space by movement and touch. An example by the time-taking procedures which Kant's defenders too often ignore. This argument, if it is valid, tells against all who try to isolate something called visual space, whether or not they say that Kant told the truth about it. For example, one who says that Kant was wrong even about visual space reports. In very recent years, experimental mathematical optical researches by Erkki Luneburg and A. Blank have even led these authors to contend that although the physical space in which sensory depth perception by binocular vision is effective is Euclidean, the binocular visual space resulting from psychometric coordination processes, Lobachevskian hyperbolic geometry of constant curvature. This contention suggests several questions. It does indeed. Space and objects. 3. 11. Chaotic experience. I have discussed two attempts to derive from the premise that the outer world must be spatial the conclusion that it must be perfectly Euclidean. In one of these, spatial is equated with exactly geometrizable, and Euclid's is assumed to be the only possible geometry, while in the other, only our actual physical space is considered. And what is said about that is restricted to what could be learned about it from single glances. I want to turn now from the over-discussed conclusion of these two derivations to their common premise, namely that outer experience must pertain to things in space. In a space, not necessarily in our space or even our kind of space. I accept this premise and shall support it with arguments which I draw not from Kant but from the captured sounds of Strawson's individuals. My debt to this captor is great. If I supply details which Strawson omits, or take his argument in directions which he does not explore, this is because my central concerns are not his. If we ask, say, what makes a glimpse of a horse race outer and a certain buzzing sound of only inner, we shall have to handle too many differences at once. We must therefore simplify, e.g. by considering one sense only. Smell, taste, and sensitivity to temperature are too ill organized, and sight and touch are too closely linked to physicality. and thus to the familiar contingencies of our kind of space, to be safely used. Strawson therefore adopts the heuristic fiction of a creature. I shall call him the hearer, whose sensory intake is all auditory. Suppose that the hearer's sensory history consists in a chaos about which nothing general can be said except that it is auditory and chaotic. Can he find work for the distinction between only inner and outer, in example, between experiences which are just his auditory states and ones which are hearings of sounds that independently of him are there to be heard? Watson's negative answer is right, of course, but I want to show in detail why. For the hearer to have a use of I heard an objective sound, we must have a use for a sound now exists unheard by me. We can speak of unheard sounds because we can have indirect evidence for a sound's existing, but this relies upon causal order, and the hearer's experience is ex hypothesis chaotic. Let us suppose then that the hearer tries to force the notion of an unheard sound upon his world in the following manner. He takes each of his auditory states to be the hearing of a short segment of a continuous repetitive sound. If the segment is uniform, then so is the unending sound sequence of which it is a part. If the segment consists in a snatch of melody, say, then the sequence of which it is a part is an endless repetition of that snatch of melody, equipped with a Weltanschauung in which these continuous sound sequences, auditory particulars, as Strawson calls them, have a role. The hearer can say, I now heard a sound sequence which existed earlier, but which was not heard by me because I was in the presence of other sequences altogether. Now the hearer's notion of an auditory particular is vacuous unless any such particular could in principle be heard more than once. So he must have criteria for the truth of I have heard this sequence before. The only criterion available in a chaos could be in discernibility of similarity. Two auditory states count as hearings of the same objective sound sequence if and only if they are exactly alike, or alike at least to some specified degree. Let us suppose the hearer to adopt a weakish criterion of this kind. Has he now a concept of an objective auditory particular? Perhaps he has, but his concept is idle, and so his distinction between outer and only inner is idle too. The only grounds he could have for calling an experience only inner or hallucinatory would be that he had never before had one sufficiently like it. But to identify the hallucinatory with the unfamiliar is to abuse the ordinary sense of hallucinatory, and is not to employ the outer only inner distinction as I have explained it. Nor can the hearer have a working notion of a mishearing, in example, of a non-standard or potentially misleading hearing of an objective sound sequence. To know that one misheard X is to be a position to say, if all I had had to go by was the way X sounded. I should not have said it was X I was hearing, or our hearer can never say this, for all he ever has to go by is the way X sounds. Nor can the hearer make sense of two objective sound sequences which are exactly alike. He defines identity as an extreme case of similarity, and for him, the identity of indiscernibles is therefore analytic. Our ordinary objectivity concepts serve A. to mark off sensory states which are not perceptions of anything objective, B. to distinguish good from bad views, standard from non-standard hearings, etc., and C. to separate the question of what a thing is like from the question of what thing it is. The hearer's concept of an auditory particular is a fraud because it performs none of these central tasks of our ordinary objectivity concepts. 12. An ordered world. The hearer cannot distinguish identity from extreme similarity because that distinction will require attention, or at least the possibility of one, between what he can say about an auditory state on the basis of what it is like in itself, in example, its monadic properties, and what he can say about it on other grounds, in example, its relations with other auditory states. But an auditory state's relational properties cannot provide reasons for or against any claim as to its identity unless there are some true general statements about the relations amongst the hearer's auditory states, and this is contrary to the hypothesis of chaos. To give the hearer a working concept of an objective sound sequence, therefore he must introduce a degree of order into his experience. To this end, Strawson makes the following proposal. The hearer's sensory states all include the hearing of a master sound, a continuous sound of unvarying timbre and loudness, ranging in pitch over the whole audible scale. There is a correlation between the master sound aspects and the other aspects of his auditory states. Whenever he hears the master sounds at middle C, he also hears green leaves. Whenever he hears the master sound at high G, he also hears Finlandia, and so on. The auditory chaos does not support the working concept of an objective sound sequence, says Strawson, because it contains nothing analogous to the feature of our world with which the idea of identifiable particulars existing continuously while unobserved is mostly intimately, naturally, and generally connected. For us, he says, the crucial idea is that of a spatial system of objects through which oneself, another object moves, but which extends beyond the limits of one's observation at any moment. This idea obviously supplies the necessary non-temporal dimension for, so to speak, the housing of the objects, which are held to exist continuously, thought unobserved. This condition is satisfied now that there is a regular relationship between positions of the master scale and the other aspects of the hearer's auditory states. The master scale is short, is necessary non-temporal dimension. If the hearer is asked where was X when you were hearing Y, He can now answer X was at middle C as always, and I did not hear it because I was at E above middle C, where E always is. So concludes Strason, the hearer can now have a working concept of an auditory particular. I accept this conclusion for other reasons too. Firstly, the hearer can now treat some of his auditory states as hallucinatory and others as not so. If at middle C on the master scale he normally hears major arpeggios, but just once hears tritones instead, he can say that on that isolated occasion he had an hallucination. Secondly, he can have the concept of a mishearing. One time when I was at low F, it was as I thought I were hearing a phrase from Greensleeves in the major, but that must have been a mishearing. For every other time I have been there, I have heard that phrase in the minor. The fact that mishearings and hallucinations must be rare if the hearer's world is not to relapse into chaos only strengthens the analogy between his concepts and ours. Thirdly, the hearer can now say there are two exactly similar sound sequences, 3 octaves apart. For him, the identity or indiscernibles is no longer analytic. Strawson invents an opponent who protests that it is misleading to call the auditory world spatial when it contains nothing like our paradigm of spatiality, viz. a Sian spatial array. Strawson meets his objection, which depends on the obsession with single visual fields, much too tolerantly. His imagined opponent does, however, make one pertinent remark to which Strawson does not reply, namely that when we visually sort out a scene into its spatially related parts, we need no changing master patch to give us the idea of the dimensions which provide the spatial ordering. Now it is indeed a flaw in Strawson's story that the spatial ordering of the auditory particulars is created by their relations not with one another but with a further particular, namely the omnipresent master sound. One consequence of this pointed out to me by Strawson is that the hearer cannot get lost. The only sense he can give to where am I is that of there I am I on the scale of the master sound, and he can always learn the answer to this just by listening. This feature of Strawson auditory world has no analog in our own. So I want to show how he could dispense with it. First, a preliminary point. Strawson's hearer gets from one place to another on the master scale only by passing through each intermediate place, but the spatial order will survive if the hearer could switch instantaneously from place to place on the master scale. Strawson compares the hearing of non-master sounds with what can be heard by rotating the tuning knob of a radio. In the radio analogy which I propose, wavelengths are selected by pressing buttons. If we do not weaken Strawson's story, if this way we can weaken it in another, namely by silencing the master sound. All the master sound does is to give the hearer a definition of between for non-master sounds in terms of between in respect of pitch. For the associated master sounds, X is between Y and Z. Is defined as the master sound which accompanies X is between in respect of pitch what which accompanies Y and which accompanies Z. It is this betweenness relation which enables the hearer to string all the non-master sounds on a single dimension, but he could as well define X is between Y and Z as X is heard at some time between any time at which Y is heard and any time as Z at which Z is heard. In Strawson's account, the spatial betweenness of non-master sounds is defined out of pitch relations amongst master sounds. In my proposed revision, it is defined instead out of ordinary temporal relations, and there is no work left to the master sound to do. In my version of the auditory world, the hearer can get lost for now. His question, where am I, is a question about how he is travelated to this or that sound with which he is familiar, and finding the answer to this requires not just listening but memory. If he travel in his sleep far enough along the dimension of his world, he might wake up knowing neither how far away nor what direction were the sounds with which he was familiar. This could not happen to Strawson hearer. A special auditory world then does not need an audible dimension. I shall find it convenient to concentrate on auditory worlds ordered by a master sound rather than by the travel-based betweenness relation which I have introduced, but everything I say will apply mutatis mutandis to the latter as well. 13. An order-changing world. Strawson allows that a sound sequence may go out of existence and be replaced at the same point on the master scale by another. There is birth and death in his auditory world. It is clear that if that world is not to lose its objectivity, a high proportion of sound sequences must have fairly long histories, a fact which has its analog in our world. Strawson's auditory world is static. There is birth and death in it, but no movement. Let us remedy this by supposing that the associations between sound sequences and places on the master scale are subject to change. Such changes must normally occur fairly slowly, not faster than a semitone an hour, say. If at noon Green's leaves is at middle C on the master scale, then at 3 p.m. it must be somewhere in the 3-tone interval AD, around middle C, of course. It may still, or again, be at middle C. Further detail can be filled in as one pleases. In the auditory world, nature does, or does not, abhor a vacuum. Two sound sequences can or cannot occur in the same place at the same time, and so on. I have imposed a speed limit upon the sound sequences because, without it, there will be chaos again. The spatial order of the auditory world consists in A, an omnipresent master sound, and B, associations between the master sound pitch and the non-master sound, to allow the latter to move, subject to a general speed limit, is to modify B, but to allow them to move with no restrictions on speed is to abolish B, and thus to revert to chaos. For A unaided by B has no power to resolve the chaos into order. The necessity for a speed limit can be shown in another way which does not depend upon the details of how this particular auditory world has been constructed. If there were no speed limit, then any position of a sound sequence at one time would be consistent with any positions of sound sequences and at other times. In that case, the hearer's decision about what to make of his auditory state at a given time could not be affected by what his auditory states were at other times. All his criteria will have to concern the nature of the single auditory state he has trying to classify or interpret, and thus he will be no better off than he was in the chaos. A speed limit is also needed in our world. We identify physical things largely by their locations. It is no accident that discussions of the identity of indiscernibles often work around to considering whether a pair of objects could be quantitatively exactly alike, although spatially separate. Nor it is an accident, as Kant knew, that Leibniz, who did think the identity of indiscernibles to be necessary, also thought that a spatial separation of two objects is a qualitative difference between them. But if physical things could and often did move unlimitedly fast, no facts about spatial positions could have the slightest bearings on any problem about re-identification. We could develop the auditory world still further by permitting sound sequences to change qualitatively as well as to move. Here again, objectivity is lost unless there is a limit on the rapidity of alteration. This, like the speed limit of movement, has its analogy in our own world. Objectivity concept is set loose to the chaos, but to get some grip on the static world ordered by the master sound, I think it will be generally agreed that their security of tenure increases as the ordered complexity of the auditory world increases. Through the introduction of a travel-based order of movement or of qualitative change, an auditory world with a travel-based order containing sound sequences which move and alter is one in which the concept of an objective auditory particular will be intuitively left to have a very secure place indeed. This could be justified by showing that with each development of the auditory story, the distinction between identity and similarity becomes richer, the concepts of hallucination and mishearing more complex and subtle, and so on. But now I'm going to justify it in another way. 14. A theory of concept utility. Our findings fit nicely a certain general theory about what makes it permissible or mandatory to apply a given concept to a given subject matter. This theory is is constant with Kant's views about the nature of rational activity, but I have arrived at it as a corollary of Quine's two dogmas of empiricism. Quine's view that questions about truth always involve questions about conceptual efficiency, that in the last resort, the true theory is the one which copes most economically with the facts, has the following consequence. If one has a language L in which to describe a subject matter S, it is legitimate to add a new concept C to the stock of concepts in L in proportion as L with C can describe S more simply than can L without C. Concepts are simplifiers. In particular, they are abbreviators. I shall not try to prove this sub-theory, but I shall test it by bringing it to bear upon the inquiry into auditory worlds. And again, in 51 upon a problem about private language. Let us take two objectivity statements which can be made thought idly in the auditory chaos, and see how they come out in a subjective language. In example, one in which objectivity concepts play no part. At T I heard an objective sound is equivalent to T I had an auditory experience. I heard the same objective sound as T1 as I heard at T2 is equivalent to my auditory state was nearly the same as T1 as T2. In neither case, nor in any other, we might say is the hearer's reporting to his experience any more compact in the objective than in the subjective language. But now consider at T I heard an objective sound, a set in the static world ordered by a master sound. This is equivalent to something like my auditory state at T had a master and a non-master component, and over a period of time including T, almost every auditory experience I have had whose master component has been exactly like that one has also had a non-master component exactly or nearly like that one. The world almost allows for hallucinations at times other than T, nearly allows for mishearings at T or at other times, and over a period of time including T allows that the objective sound heard at T may not be sempiternal. Here a statement in the purely sensory language is about 8 times as long as its equivalent in the objective language. The statement I heard the same objective sound as T1 as at T2 is spelled out similarly in the subjective language, gives a result which is some 6 times as long. However, in these two cases, as in those that follow, the abbreviating power of objectivity concepts is really much greater than is shown by my rather simplified expansions of objective into subjective statements. In the world where sound sequences move, objectivity concepts save more words still. In that world, the statement at T I heard an objective sound spells out into something like at T my auditory state had a master component M, and a non-master component N. such that over a period of time, including T, every auditory state whose non-master component was very like N has had a master component differing in pitch from M by not more units of pitch than there were units of time between T and the time of the auditory state in question, plus a complex condition to allow for there being another non-master sound very like N. The whole tedious thing, oversimplified as it is, will be some 20 times as long as its objective equivalent. The spelling out in subjective terms of I heard the same objective sound as T1 as at T2 will take about a page and a half. Objectivity concepts have even more abbreviating power in a world where things alter as well as move, and in one which a travel-based ordering. In a world with both these features, such concepts will be more powerful still. For example, many pages will be required to give the sensory cache value of the objective statement, I think I am lost. I think I am lost. The Quenon theory of concept utility has passed its test. Its judgment as to a concept's legitimacy, which was reached in 1113 by considering the specific jobs, which it does has also been reached by considering its abbreviating powers. Why the two sets of results have coincided is plain enough. To say what a concept does a certain job is to say that it affects a certain kind of abbreviation. There are questions not only about when we may, but also when we must apply a given concept to a given subject matter. In our world, it is often said it is not just permissible but mandatory to use the concept of a physical object. There is one simple reason for saying this: ignoring sophisticated worries about whether there could be a purely objective language, namely what the concept of a physical object does the job of abbreviation so well that without it we should get almost nothing thought or said. It will all take too long. I suggest that when Strawson asks, the auditory world will have to be like for the hearer to be forced into using the concept of I. He obscures the move from objectivity to self-consciousness by combining it with this other move from what concepts may he have to what concepts must he have. (15) The status of Strawson's theory. The argument of 1112 tends to show that outer experience must be of a spatial world. Every auditory world I have described has had an ordering analogous to that of point on a straight line, but this was not necessary. For example, a travel-based betweenness relation could yield a circular world, and many other variations are possible too. But objectivity concepts have work to do. It seems only in worlds which are spatial in a fairly strong sense. Thought there is no privileged number of dimensions, nor a privilege for Euclid's or any other geometry. This, which I shall call Strawson's theory, is roughly equivalent to Kant's theory that outer experience must be of things in space. Let us see how the two theories compare as to status. It is hard to avoid the conclusion that Strawson's theory is analytic if it is true at all. I have not defended the theory by including spatial in the definition of outer. On the contrary, I have defined outer as of something that other than oneself, and have then explored the implications of it as thus defined. The explorations turned on meaning relationships between other than oneself and existing perceived, having a history, re-indefinable, re-identifiable, and so on. Strawson's theory is far from self-evident, but this is just because it arises in such a complex way out of those elementary facts about meanings which constitute the whole grounds for accepting it. When we recall the problems which beset Kant's theory, if it is taken to be synthetic and a priori, we may well feel some relief at being able to classify Strawson's theory as unobvious but analytic. There is little to be said for restricting analytic to conceptual truths, which are obviously or true by definition, but Strawson's theory, as well as being unobvious, has another feature which might be urged as a reason for not calling it analytic. Compare A. Anything square is rectangular, with B. Anything square belongs to a world in which objective angular measurements can be made. A. Says that a thing must be like to count as square. B. Seems to do this too, but the condition which it lays down is also a condition on anything's being in a plane sense not square, while A concerns the applicability of square. B concerns the utility of the square, not square distinction. Strawson's theory is like B rather than A. It says that only in spatial world is work done by the distinction between outer and only inner. We might reserve the title analytic for statements like and describe a conceptual but not as analytic, such statements as B and Strawson's theory. By thus dividing conceptual truths into the analytic and the others, and putting Strawson's theory among the latter, we do not involve Strawson in Kant's difficulties over the questions: what risk of refutation does it run, and how do you know it to be true? Nor we commit Strawson theory to treating what sort of things is outer sense as an intelligible question which invites an answer in terms of noumena. The most interesting truths which Kant calls synthetic and a priori have something like the status I have claimed for Strawson theory. They are unobvious analytic truths about the condition under which certain distinctions can be made, or under which certain concepts can have a significant use, affirmative or negative. We shall see furthermore that Kant's arguments are appropriate to his conclusions having this status. So I offer his heuristic rule. When Kant calls something synthetic and a priori, proceed as thought he has said that it is true about conceptual interrelations of the same general sort as Strawson's theory. Whatever Kant's conscious intentions were, whatever he really meant, this rule is an aid to deriving philosophical insights from what he wrote. Mention should be made of one specific similarity and one specific dissimilarity between Strawson's theory and the judgments which can call synthetic and a priori. One, it may be noted that the argument of 1112 proves only that speciality is sufficient for objectivity. In relation to the converse of this, in example, in relation to Strawson's theory, the argument is inconclusive. I suggest that Strawson's theory is of a kind which cannot be proved conclusively. It is sometimes the case that in arguing that condition C must obtain if distinction D is to have work to do, one must rest content with showing that C does obtain in certain situations where D have work to do, and arguing that one's examples have covered all the relevant territory. In such a case, one is inevitably at the mercy of the overlooked possibility, and one's conclusion must be of the form it looks as thought D cannot be used unless C obtains. This is reminiscent of some of Kant's remarks about synthetic a priori judgments. I shall later discuss certain judgments whose truth is supposed to stem from certain a priori brute facts about the nature of the human understanding. The notion of an a priori brute fact about the understanding, unattractive as it is, has similarities with the notion of a conceptual fact, which can be reported in such words as it looks as thought we have no way of utilizing D unless C obtains. 2. Analytic judgments are all a priori, but what use it is this fact is connection with Strawson theory, of which we can say only that if it is true, it is analytic, none but then a priority, as such is never of much interest anyway. We can say that the judgment expressed by a given sentence is a priori or unfalsifiable, only because we can say that the sentence could come to say something false only by coming to express a judgment other than the one it now expresses. This is a harmless maneuver, but it yields a hollow victory. This sort of a priori does not offer intellectual security of a significant kind. We cannot peel the judgment. We cannot peel the judgment or proposition off from the sentence and have the comfort of knowing that it, never mind how it is expressed, cannot be falsified. Strawson's theory is analytic if it is true at all. The point of this is not that if the theory is true, then it is necessarily invulnerably true, but rather that the arguments which can be adduced in support of the theory are of a certain kind. Specifically, they consist in certain ways of assembling facts about meanings. It is not always clear when a fact is about meanings, but this is one of the cases in which it is clear. So we ought not to share Kant's passion for the a priori, even if we can represent his results as analytic. It is often convincing to express his questions and answers in terms of certainties and necessities, but the virtue of his answer does not lie in the limits they set to what our experience could be like, but lies rather in the light they threw on our handling of the experience we do have. The impossibility that there should be an objective but non-special world does not matter. What matters is a fact. If it is a fact about the way in which objectivity and speciality are connected in our conceptual scheme. Four, the inner sense theory. 16. The form of inner sense. Kant says that time is the form of inner sense, a space in the form of outer sense. All experienced things outside oneself must be spatially ordered, and all experience whatsoever must be temporally ordered. Here is an analog. A submarine captain wears sunglasses all the time and sees beyond his submarine only through a slightly defective periscope. Everything he sees looks green, and everything he sees outside his vessel looks blurred as well. This analog, like the piano one in 5, is inadequate and dangerous. Still, it illustrates Kant's view of the formal relationship between inner and outer sense, and its very defects serve to remind us that Kant is offering his doctrine of inner sense as synthetic, may have to construe inner sense as a nominal mechanism which stamps temporarily upon its products. A preliminary point: I have not spoken of outer experience as itself being spatial or Euclidean, because I do not think that spatial terms can be applied in their ordinary meanings of experience. In example, to sensory states of sense data. Those who think that spatial concepts are rooted in visual considerations and who treat visual sense data as thought, they were thin colored pictures, will cheerfully apply spatial terms to visual sense data. The green patch is to the left of the red patch and a little larger than it. Wishing to avoid this kind of talk, I have spoken of outer experience not as Euclidean but as Euclid confirming, or as a something Euclidean, or in the weaker version of something spatial. The situation changes, however, when we come to the inner sense theory. It is not satisfactory to express Kant's thesis in the form all inner experience must be of something which is temporal, for some inner experience is not, in any plain sense, of anything at all. I here reject Kant's unhappy notion that just an outer experience in one's encounter with an objective real, inner experience is one's encounter with oneself, but we can speak of experience as being itself temporal in a way in which we cannot speak of it as being itself spatial. My outer experience is experience of a world in which both spatial and temporal, but all my sensory states, whether or not they are perceptions of an outer world, do themselves occur in a temporal order, do themselves have durations, and so on. So we can legitimately express Kant's thesis in the form all inner experience is temporal. What are we to make of this thesis? Can we find an analytic version of it, analogous of the Straussonian version of the outer sense theory? The omens are inauspicious. Strausson's theory states necessary conditions for experience to count as outer, but there are no tests which experience must pass in order to count as inner. Inner experience is just experience. Perhaps then we can say that temporality is a feature which anything must have in order to count as experience at all. If this were right, it could depend upon facts about the meaning of experience, and that will not be relevant to Kant's central thesis. That he wants to say is that it is at once synthetic and a priori, that all of our data, everything we are given, every brute fact with which are confronted, the whole reality we know is temporal. This vague as it admittedly is, confront us with the following question. Can we say anything about what it will be for a being to have data, known facts, be confronted with a reality to which temporal concepts did not apply? I do not think that we can. It seems that we cannot describe any possible state of affairs, whether outer or only inner, except in terms which proclaim its temporality. My auditory fictions, for example, including this story about the auditory chaos, all concerned possible courses of experience whose normal temporal order was never called into question, and it seems impossible that stories should have got underway at all, but without that basic assumption. That point concerns whether we can describe that it might be like from the inside, so to speak, to be in receipt of a temporal data. But even if we cannot see or say or envisage or image what this will be like on the inside, perhaps we can say that will be involved in knowing that some other being had temporal data, knowing that someone else can see a fourth primary color. This suggestion comes to nothing, though. To discover what another is experiencing, I must go by this linguistic and other behavior, and I cannot suppose myself to observe behavior which is temporal. And story I could tell about another's experience will therefore have a subject matter which has correlated with a temporal stream of behavior. So the subject matter demands experience will itself have to be temporal, unless someone's behavior could express his experience without endowing it with temporality. I do not believe that there could be a behavior experience correlation such that both the behavior expressed or was evidence for the experience and the behavior was temporal and the experience not. It may be said that we do already have a temporal data, or at any rate a temporal topics of discourse, namely prepositions and numbers. In 24, I shall argue that prepositions are abstractions from our handling of sentences. This is not to deny that there are propositions, but it is to take a certain view of what kind of thing a proposition is. In example, of what kind of utility the preposition terminology has. From this view, it follows that our talking about and thinking about preposition is rooted in and depended upon temporal facts about how languages are used. Prepositions preposition is a theoretical term whose proper function, if it has one, is to facilitate our theorizing about linguistic behavior. If this is right, then prepositions do not constitute a temporal subject of discourse in any way which contradicts the thesis I have been defending. To suppose that a being might have knowledge of prepositions but not of anything temporal would be like supposing that a being might have knowledge of physical forces but not of anything which has subject to any such force. Similarly with numbers, there are no tenses or dates in arithmetic, but that does not free it from its essential connections with operations or identifying, discriminating, and counting. If we cannot develop the supposition that a being might have a temporal data or knowledge of a temporal reality, is this because the supposition is self-contradictory? If this were so, then all data are temporal, will be analytic, and all data are temporal, will be analytic, and so we should, after all, be able to handle Kant's inner sense theory in a way analogous with the Straussian salvage of part of the outer sense theory. But I do not think that it is so. There seems to be only three ways in which I might be, and none of them apply. First, there is the kind of analytic truth expressed by Straussian theory. All F's are G. Is analytic because all our ways of bringing something under the concept of F require its falling under the concept of G. All our ways of bringing experience under objectivity concepts require its being experience of something spatial. It cannot be analytic if that way that all data are temporal. Kant's thesis does not allege the impossibility of bringing data under one concept, but not another, but allege the impossibility of not bringing experience under one concept. This Straussian kind of analytic truth reports a connection between two aspects of our conceptual scheme, two aspects of our way of handling whatever data we have to handle. It says something of the form our data must be handled in this way, brought under spatial concepts. If it is to be handled in that way, brought under objectivity concepts, but if all data are temporal, is analytic, then it says unconditionally, our data must be handled in this way, brought under temporal concepts. The only alternative is having no data to handle. Second, still, it might be analytic, that all data are temporal because of facts about the meaning of data and related terms, or attempts to describe a being whose data are atemporal are not obscure. I have argued in one by any kind of meaning relationship between atemporal and any other terms which the being is supposed to apply to his data, but the obstacle might be a meaning relationship all the same. Perhaps the stipulation of atemporality is inconsistent with the claim that what we are describing are data. I use data and experience, sensory states, and all the rest to point to the very general notion of a basis for knowledge of what is the case. And there are analytic truths about all data in this sense. For example, it is analytic that only a conscious being has data. I cannot tell a story about a being who has no conscious states, yet does have data. And if someone announced that he has going to do he was going to do just that and still explain the data in terms of basis for knowledge and the like. We should have to conclude that he did not understand knowledge or conscious or some other relevant words in its ordinary meaning. Well, the suggestion is that A. I am going to describe atemporal data is like B. I am going to describe data of being without consciousness. This suggestion seems to be wrong, whereas B announced a flatly self-contradictory program. A announces rather a hopeless program. Those who have credited God with a temporal knowledge of reality have surely not been contradicting themselves, as thought they had said that God knows the fraction which is equal to two rooted. Their claim is rather one which we do not understand. We cannot see what is it comes to, or we see how to feel it in any details. It is satisfactory to describe B as self-contradictory partly because we can say, if your story is going to banish consciousness, it will have to banish data. And this need no mean. There will have to be no story. A story about a world in which there is no consciousness. For example, about our planet before there was life on it. Can be presented as the story which will be told by a conscious being if there were one there. A world without consciousness may be presented as knowable. In example so described that we can say that is how we should observe it to be if it were left all dead like that, except for the introduction of us as observers. But A offers no analog to this, to the person who proposed to describe atemporal data. We cannot say, if time is to be banished from your story, you will have to leave data out. By all means describe an atemporal world, giving the story which will be told by a being with data if there were one there. But don't put any such being into the story, or you will have temporality back in the story after all. This program is as impossible as A itself. I conclude that we are not helped to understand the status of all data are temporal by comparing it with all data are had by conscious beings. Third, perhaps atemporal is a self-contradictory predicate. It seems that there is some obstacle to our describing any subject matter without using temporal concepts, as thought atemporality were inconsistent with everything. A predicate which, for routine analytic reasons, cannot consistently figure in any story must be an internally inconsistent predicate. This will solve our problem by putting we cannot describe an atemporal reality on a pair with we cannot describe a reality in which things are red and not colored. If there were the solution, though, temporal would be a tautological predicate. An example, one which is universally applicable for the same sort of reason that either colored is not red, is universally applicable. That seems hopelessly wrong. It does not look at all as thought temporal is tautological or atemporal self-contradictory. It seems rather that, although there is no logical trouble within atemporal, everything we have to say nevertheless involves temporality, and so one square with atemporality. For these reasons, I agree with Kant's view that the temporality of the given is a fact which, although contingent, cannot be thought away. Nor does it seem plausible that to say that we could envisage or describe a temporal data if only our imaginations were more limber or our vocabularies larger. It is here that one feels most sympathy with Kant's belief that there are extremely basic, not quite empirical, statements which can be known to hold true for all humans. But this is not to allow that such statements can be neatly classed as synthetic and a priori. Still less it is to accept Kant's kind of theory about how they are possible. The minimal objection of temporality is tempered upon experience by inner sense, in that it speaks of what is done by inner sense, and it therefore presupposes temporality. Without appealing to anything like a nominal inner sense, we can alleviate and perhaps remove the discomfort of having to admit that there is a fact whose contingency cannot be shown by describing a contrary possibility. I can envisage being satisfied that someone could see a new primary color, only because my evidence for this could consist in data which did not themselves include the seeing of such a color. But I could not believe that someone has in touch with a temporal reality. On the basis of data, my data, which were temporarily organized, or again, I can imagine myself encountering as invisible physical object, because if I set aside all my visual experience, there remains an adequate basis for a notion of physicality, but no part of my experience relates to the world's temporality, as my visual experience does not as my visual experience does to its visibility. If I were to imagine being confronted by an atemporal reality, I should have to build on parts of my experience which are not time and infected. But there are no such parts. Our experience is, so to speak, saturated with temporality, and this is why we cannot talk or think about what it will be like to be confronted with a reality which was atemporal. Kant's view that the temporality is the given is a fact about it is embodied in a somewhat unhappy fashion in his transcendental idealism about time. We deny to time all claim to absolute reality. That is to say, we deny that it belongs to things absolutely, or as their condition or property independently of any reference to the form of our sensible intuition. Properties that belong to things in themselves can never be given to us through the senses. This, then, is what constitutes the transcendental the ideality of time. Insofar as this expresses the claim that it is not analytic that all our data are temporal, it is acceptable, but there is a difficulty here all the same. It can be approached through an objection which can apparently found both popular and irritating. Against my theory, which admits the empirical reality of time but denies its absolute and transcendental reality, I have heard men of intelligence so unanimously voicing an objection. that I must suppose it to occur spontaneously to every reader to whom this way of thinking is unfamiliar. The objection is this: alterations are real, this being proved by change of our own representations, inner states, even if all outer appearances together with their alterations be denied. Now alterations are possible only in time, and time is therefore something real. This objection concerns skepticism about time. His opponents, Kant says, allow that space is transcendentally ideal because they think it possible that there may really be nothing spatial at all, that space may be an illusion, and they object that time is not transcendentally ideal because it is certainly not an illusion, since the reality of some changes is immediately evident through consciousness. Kant replies in effect that skepticism is beside the point. The issue is not about whether time is real, he says, but about what it means to say that time is real. This rebuttal is correct. Here, as almost always in serious philosophy, skepticism is beside the point. Still, Kant invites such misunderstandings when he says things like, "We deny to time all claim to absolute reality," rather than using the more sober formulation he gives to his transcendental idealism about space. It is solely from the human standpoint that we can speak of space, of extended things, etc. If we depart from the subjective condition under which alone we can have outer intuition, the representation of space stems from nothing whatsoever. This predicate can be ascribed to things only insofar as they appear to us, that is, only to objects of sensibility. This is better. Properly expressed, transcendental idealism about any concept C says that it is only because of the way our experience is that we have any use of the concept C. If C is the concept of objective time, or of the temporal order of objective events and processes, then transcendental idealism about it says that it is only because of the way our experience is that we can place objective events and processes in an objective temporal order. This seems to be what Kant means when he says that time does not belong to things absolutely. This, however, is just an aspect of Kant's transcendental idealism about objectivity concepts generally. It is not a controversial addition to it. The position is not transcendental idealism. The position is not transcendental idealism implies to objective worlds, and also, surprising as it may seem, to objective time, but rather transcendental idealism applies to the objective world and therefore as a trivial consequence to objective time. Yet Kant's opponents can be excused from finding his transcendental idealism about time controversial, for Kant claims to be a transcendental idealism about time, not just about objective time. Time is the form of inner sense, in showing how our experience makes it possible for us to have objectivity concepts, including the concept of an objective temporal order. Kant must tell a story which assumes that our inner states can be set in a temporal order, and this will show up embarrassingly the extent to which he has fallen short of giving a transcendental idealist account of the concept of time. So even if Kant's opponents were wrong to say you can You can be skeptical about time because even our inner states are in time. He might justly have said, what you call the experimental basis for the concept of time is only the experimental basis for the concept of objective time. Kant will have to reply that he does mean to assert transcendental idealism about time generally, and thus that our ability to bring even our sensory states under temporal concepts depends upon the way our experience is, the way our sensory states are. So indeed it does. It depends on the fact that they occur in a temporal order, but this is not transcendental idealism, but merely the trivial claim that what concept something falls under depends falls under depends upon what it is like. Transcendental idealism about subjective time is not false but trivial. In general, I suggest it is not informative to say of any concept which applies to sensory states themselves that we could have no use for it if it were not for the way our sensory states are. Phenomenalisms are designed to operate across the subjective-objective borderline. So it will be fair for Kant's opponents to claim that transcendental idealism about time cannot be expressed in such a way as to be both non-trivial and comprehensive. This will deflate Kant's position in a little, but will not refute it.